Good evening to all. This is Uma and welcome to our broadcast. Today we're all gathered here to talk about COVID-19, a new disease causing severe acute respiratory symptoms which are provoked by the virus SARS-CoV-2, currently putting all of us in this pandemic. So in this broadcast, we will have 4 parts. Firstly, we will talk about COVID-19's origins, the ways of infection, and the symptoms. Then, we will move on to the second theme, COVID-19 variants, their origins, and effects on the vaccine's efficiency. Following this, we will discuss about battling the virus by the means of preventions, including vaccines. And lastly, we will answer to your questions, which you will be able to directly send in during the broadcast. So it is a true honor to have with us first Première Biology Specialty and second students from FIS, and more importantly, 2 globally renowned researchers from HKU Pasteur, Professor Ben Cowling and Dr. Sophie Valkenburg. So could you please briefly introduce yourselves?
Yep, good evening. I'm Ben Cowling. I'm a professor at the University of Hong Kong. I've been in Hong Kong for 16 years now. I study infectious diseases, how they spread between people from one person to another and how they spread in the community as a whole, and what kind of things we can do to stop them from spreading. So face masks, social distancing, etc. And of course vaccines. And so I've been working on influenza, other infections for many years, and for the past year focusing on COVID-19.
All right, thank you.
And I'm from the Hong Kong Pasteur as well. I'm Sophie Valkenburg, a viral immunologist. So I'm really interested in how our body can fight these viruses either through recovering from infection, so maybe some people do better than others, and what type of response those people have mounted, and how the vaccines could emulate these responses. So we look in animal models for some experimental vaccines and also next generation vaccines. I work with Ben in randomized controlled trials to compare influenza vaccines and now recovery from SARS-CoV-2 infection.
Thank you very much. So let's get to it and begin with our first theme, COVID-19, their origins, ways of infection, and symptoms. So our first questions are from Hugo.
So, hello. First of all, could you remind us what a virus is exactly and how it causes disease?
Okay, so viruses are obligate intracellular parasites, so they really can't replicate by themselves, which is different to fungi or bacteria, which can make more copies of themselves. So viruses have to take over the host cell machinery to make more copies of themselves. And they do this by overtaking our normal cellular processes to make more copies of themselves. And then during that infection, where you might be just infected with a few particles of virus, within a few days you can make hundreds of millions of viruses. So this is a really rapid process where it takes over our cells, causes disease directly through killing cells, so your lungs are torn apart by the flu virus, but you also cause a lot of inflammation by that, drawing in local cellular responses that can then flood the tissues.
And what makes the SARS-CoV-2 so contagious, and why did it cause a global pandemic?
So unfortunately, we're immunologically naive against the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So because this is a virus that just really recently jumped across the species barrier, we don't have a prior immune education against this. There's related coronaviruses that cause the common cold, and they're a lot more mild in their infection, but there isn't much cross-reactivity in our immune response between those. So this is why the virus can spread so rapidly between us, because we don't have a barrier between that domino effect of transmission. So the next person can pass to the next one and the other. But once you start having immune people in between, there's going to be less viral transmission.
And lastly, how do we know if we're contagious or not?
So with the SARS-CoV-2 virus, when it infects a person, quite often they'll have symptoms, maybe a cough, maybe a fever, maybe they'll lose their sense of smell or taste. And at that point, within the first few days of their symptoms appearing, they could be very contagious. But actually one of the issues that we have, one of the problems we have with the SARS-CoV-2 virus is some people can be infected and not even know it, not have any symptoms, but still be breathing out the virus, into the environment and infecting other people. And that's one of the factors that makes it really difficult to stop. So how do we know if one person actually has the infection or not? The best way is to take a sample, maybe a swab from the nose, and test it in a laboratory to see if the virus is there. And if the virus is there, then we know they're infected and maybe contagious. If it's negative, if the test is negative, then that person may be not infected, or at least not contagious. And that's what's being done right now in Hong Kong. When they track down the contacts of other infected people, they'll do a test to see if that person has the virus or not.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, next set of questions are from Zoe.
Hi, my first question would be, can the virus be transmitted from a pregnant mother to an unborn child?
I don't think there's any record of that happening, because the coronavirus is a respiratory virus. It doesn't enter the bloodstream, it doesn't spread through the blood. So some other infections could spread from a pregnant mother to the baby inside, but COVID can't spread in that way. Of course, once the baby's born, then if the mother's caring for the baby, nursing the baby, there's a possibility to transmit the infection that way. But while it's still inside, I don't think so.
Thank you very much. And my second question is, can someone be infected more than once with the virus?
Yeah, actually one of the first cases of reinfection was reported from Hong Kong. It shouldn't happen too often, because after the first infection you have some immunity which protects you. So you would have a lower chance to get infected again, but it's not perfect. And we have seen a number of cases of reinfection around the world have been reported, and the first of those was in Hong Kong.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so I think we covered all the questions we had for the first part. Now let's move on to our second theme, COVID-19's variants, their origin, so where do they come from, and their effects on the vaccine's efficiency. So let's begin the second theme with first Elisa, who's going to ask some questions.
So good evening, everyone. So my first question is, how do mutations occur, and how do variants differ from one another?
Okay, so SARS-CoV-2 is an RNA virus. It does have a proofreading enzyme within itself, so as it makes more copies of itself, it does check for spelling errors, but because you're getting such widespread infection and you're getting such high viral loads, you have many chances for this virus to change. And that's really how these viruses can move through a population, and they're changing with time. So you start to think that this virus is really throwing darts at a board to see where it can break through our defences and make more copies of itself. And that's how we're now selecting these variants, in that you're getting hotspots of changes around the receptor binding domain. So that's where the antibodies can actually block infection. And that's if you have changes in these particular areas, you can evade existing immunity or some of that vaccine immunity. So viruses naturally try and find ways around these defences through a population, through natural selection.
And my second question is, are some variants more dangerous than others, and which are of concern today?
Definitely. So in the world so far, the World Health Organization has identified 3 particular variants that are of particular concern, and they call them variants of concern. The first one was identified in the United Kingdom, the second one was first identified in South Africa, the third one in Brazil. Of course, now they're spreading around the world. So the UK variant is actually prevalent in all of Europe. It's probably 90% of the virus is picked up in Europe now. It's very common in the United States. I think it's 40 to 50%. It's also dominant in Japan, which is having a surge. So although it's the UK variant, it's actually around the world. And the South Africa variant, the Brazil variant as well. These have arisen probably because of the pressure from immunity in a population. And when the virus changes, it can find improvements along the way. And so these types of viruses are maybe improved versions of the original virus. They're either easier to transmit, maybe there's more virus produced in an infection, maybe they cause more serious symptoms as well in some cases, so they're a real worry. And I think the most concerning of them is probably the Brazil variant, which has been limited so far to South America, but we could start to see it in other parts of the world. It seems to be a little bit more of a challenge to deal with than the other variants. But we're still collecting data on how well the natural immunity or the vaccine immunity will protect us against the original virus and also the variants. Hopefully the vaccines will be able to cover the variants as well.
It's even quite interesting with the UK variant. It seems like it's increasing transmission but not increasing disease. But if you start to think if that virus can cause more infections, it's also got more chances to cause more severe disease later. Whereas the South African variant seems to actually have a lot of deletions and changes within its other immune regulatory genes. So it seems to cause a bit more inflammation. So each of these viruses have different characteristics, and you see even with some of the Indian variants coming up now that they actually have combinations of some of these as well. So there's a lot of sequencing around the world to try and coordinate what are some of these common themes amongst the variants, because you see hotspots of selection, and it's really quite difficult to get a consensus on these viruses because they're each so unique, and it's hard to actually get them in the one place at the one time for some experiments to compare them in parallel. So that's something we're trying to do here in the lab as well.
So my final question is, can the efficiency of the COVID-19 vaccines be affected by the variants?
It looks like they can be affected to some extent. So particularly the South Africa variant seems to be able to evade some of the immunity that's provided by the vaccines we have. But some of the vaccines we have are very, very, very good. And so maybe that evasion just brings them down from very, very, very good to very good. So they're still very good, but they're just not as good as they were against the original virus. So it may not be too much of a concern, but we're still waiting for more data on some other vaccines, how they perform against the various different kinds of variants. And I'm concerned, of course, that in the future there may be more variants appearing, which can even escape immunity from vaccines. We'll have to wait and see, but that's a concern for the coming years, not necessarily for right now.
Okay, the last question for this section is, why is the current variant in India so problematic?
The current?
Variant in India.
In India. So in India, I think what seems to have happened in the last maybe 2 or 3 months is that there have been more and more infections, and initially maybe it wasn't recognized that there were so many more and more infections, that the incidence was growing, and so measures weren't taken. In Hong Kong, when the case numbers start coming up, the government acts very quickly. In India, it seems like maybe they didn't act so quickly, maybe they didn't think there was going to be a problem, and so when the reaction is delayed, that gives the virus a chance to spread even more, because the growth is very, very rapid in infections if there aren't any control measures in place. It's not clear that the variants that are spreading in India are particularly highly contagious, particularly severe. They may be, it's not clear, but what's happened can be explained just by maybe a lack of action, a lack of response, and a population that didn't take action to stop the virus from spreading quickly enough, so that unfortunately now there's too many infections, too many sick people, and the hospitals can't cope, and that's when there's real problems with COVID. Ordinarily, the mortality rate would be something like 1%, but it's going to go up substantially when hospitals can't look after patients, because there'll be a lot of patients who would ordinarily have been able to survive with the proper medical care, but when they can't even get into the hospital, that's a big problem. And that's something that we really want to avoid. So in the past year, there's been a lot of debate and discussion about whether we should just allow COVID to spread, because it's not that serious. The mortality rate in younger adults is not that high. But we have to recognize that one of the reasons the mortality rate is not that high is because we have hospitals, doctors and nurses, oxygen, medicines, all these things that we can use. But if we allow a lot of people to be infected all at the same time, what happens is what's happening in India, that suddenly the mortality rate goes up substantially, not because the virus is worse, but because we run out of those supplies, run out of hospital beds, doctors, oxygen, and medicine. And it's a real nightmare. So I hope it's a lesson for other countries that think maybe it's not so bad after all, that you really have to take action. Because in India, I don't think it's over by any means. I don't think it's even peaked. I think it can even go up further.
Okay, thank you very much, Mary, for your questions. Now, I think it's all the time we had for the second theme. Let's move on and introduce our third part, battling the virus by the means of preventions, including vaccines. So that we will resume this after a 30-second break. So we are still here with Professor Ben Cowling and Dr. Sophie Valkenburg, as well as our second students and our premier biology specialty students. So I suggest that we move on to the third theme of the day, which is battling the virus, vaccines, and means of prevention. Our first question is from Matthew.
First of all, good evening, Dr. Valkenburg and Professor Ben Cowling. How is the vaccine so rapidly developed when in normal cases it takes about 10 to 15 years to develop one?
It's really remarkable what's been achieved for COVID-19, because ordinarily the development cycle for vaccines really takes a very long time. Just doing a clinical trial of a vaccine could take years, but that's all been compressed into the space of less than 12 months, from initially detecting the virus until having vaccines that are approved with emergency approvals for use in many parts of the world. So it's remarkable, and it's because of maybe the number of people involved, the urgency of the problem. I know that in the US and other parts of the world, there's a lot of procedures were maybe fast-tracked to allow companies so that they could start the second trial while the first trial is almost finished. They don't need to go through the usual procedure of having you do the first trial, you think about it, you analyze, you discuss it, and then you can start the second one. They said, okay, you do the first one, but as long as it looks good, you can kind of start the second one as soon as possible. And if that looks good, then you start the third one. And so that really compressed the whole timeline. So it's a remarkable achievement.
They almost had like live reporting of the results as they came in during the review.
Yeah.
And I think even it comes back to like large investment since the 2009 pandemic in actually having these plug and play ready vaccine platforms. So there's been large consortiums to actually try and prepare for pandemics, to actually have vaccines that have a backbone that is ready to go once a sequence is identified. So I think that Moderna, within just a day or two of the sequence being identified, was already starting to produce their vaccine candidate in the lab. And so having these platforms ready for future pandemics is going to be really important. And now we're going to have greater infrastructure to actually produce these vaccines quicker than we've had previously. And the overlapping phase 1, 2, 3 clinical trials has been really impressive. And it's that concerted global effort that has been really remarkable. And even the rate of efficacy that's within some of these vaccines is incredible to have that, because there's new platforms being used in these vaccines that haven't been used before. So I think that we've been really surprised and impressed with the rate of the science in the past year.
Great. Now I would like to ask you to explain what the differences between traditional vaccines and mRNA vaccines are.
So maybe going back in history, some of the earliest vaccines that were used were just maybe attenuated forms of the virus, so a weakened form of the virus, or even a killed virus, which can be injected and the body can recognize that and respond to it and learn that if you were to face the live virus in the future, your body knows how to deal with it. And now for COVID, we have the inactivated vaccines produced in mainland China, which are an example of that technology. It's been used for many, many years. It works better for some infections than for others. But then more recently, we have other technologies that can be used. So there's the technology of putting two viruses almost together. So one rides on top of the other, like a jockey on a horse. And so the horse is the one that carries the jockey into your body and teaches your body how to deal with COVID. And the AstraZeneca vaccine is an example of that for COVID-19. And then the mRNA ones, which Sophie just mentioned, are the most impressive of all, which is a brand new technology. It's probably been studied for 10 or 15 years in clinical trials, but the COVID vaccines are the first wide-scale, large-scale use of this particular technology, which is excellent and it's great news for other infectious diseases in the future as well, I think.
And the way these RNA vaccines actually work is it's giving your body the signal to make the part of this virus that our immune system can fight to block.
The blueprint.
Yeah. It's a blueprint that's also like a self-destruct code, so it's not something that's actually going to stick around for very long. So this RNA message can come into outside our cells. We start to make parts of the virus without actually having a virus there, and our immune system can see that as a danger signal. And I think that I actually watched this amazing pipeline video I think it was on New York Times today, about how they make the actual RNA. So it comes from a bacterial backbone. It has a plasmid that they then, it goes through many different stages of processing, but they basically take that plasmid, redigest it back up into single-stranded RNA, and then they put it within these lipid nanoparticles to try and stabilize it. And this is why with RNA, because it's only that single type strand, it's really not thermostable. So you can't keep it in your regular fridge. You have to keep it in a super cold freezer. And that's where access to these RNA vaccines will be more restricted compared to the viral vectored or the inactivated vaccines, because they're a lot more fragile.
Following up on this now, I understand that HKU is conducting a trial on mixing different types of vaccines. Can we expect some advantages to this?
There may be. So there's a trial that's being done by some of our colleagues in the University of Hong Kong. If I understand correctly, they're looking at comparing people who get BioNTech and then BioNTech again, because you need 2 doses, versus BioNTech first and then Sinovac as the booster, the second dose. And so my suspicion is that maybe the BioNTech would work better, but at the population level, actually, in Hong Kong, I've been thinking if we have 7.5 million doses of BioNTech, 7.5 million doses of Sinovac, in the longer term, maybe it would be a better use of those vaccines if we use BioNTech and Sinovac, so everybody gets one of each, so you get the best of both worlds in some sense, rather than some people getting the BioNTech and some people getting just the Sinovac 2 doses. We'll see. I don't know what the results will be, how they'll come out, but I think we'll hear more about mixing vaccines in the coming months and the coming year, because the other issue is going to be booster doses. So for people that get vaccinated now, in a year or 2 or 3 or 5, maybe they'll need another dose of vaccine to give their immune system a reminder of what the virus is about, how it works, or maybe to update against the variants. So maybe have a booster against one of the variants. And for the booster dose, maybe it would be a different technology. So people who get BioNTech now, maybe in the future will get a booster dose of a different type. Maybe AstraZeneca, maybe Sinovac, maybe Moderna, maybe something else. We'll see. So we need to figure out what's the optimal combinations of different kinds of vaccines. It's not necessarily true that it's best to have the same type again and again and again.
Your immune system sort of likes to see things in different ways. So with seeing of the SARS-CoV-2 virus in different ways, you can start pulling in different parts of the immune system. And also you can have the problem of having anti-vector immunity. So where you actually might start to recognize the horse, I guess, on your jockey analogy. So you can have anti-vector immunity. We're not really, because these are new platforms that are being used, we don't actually know the duration of the response against the vector, so the vaccine backbone. But as you start to try and repeat over coming years, we might need to have different formats of those vaccines. But our immune system does like to see vaccines in different ways. So if you have like a DNA-based vaccine and then a live attenuated vaccine, you can start pulling in more responses, and you start to see that your response will get bigger and bigger with the more vaccines you normally have, up to a point. So I think that there is an advantage to having different platforms available based on the setting, based on training your immune system to pull in these different responses, and to make sure that we don't limit ourselves with the vaccine backbone that we're now not getting a full response against.
Great. And finally, there's already talk about second-generation vaccines to combat existing variants. What could we expect from them?
So I don't know exactly what's going to come out in the next year or 2 in terms of vaccines, but the mRNA vaccines are already very, very good. So maybe 6 or 9 months ago, people were imagining that the first round of vaccines wouldn't necessarily be that good. Maybe we'd be expecting 50, 67% effectiveness, and we'd have to wait a year or 2 after that until we get the really good vaccines. But actually, we've got them now. We've got the BioNTech vaccine and the Moderna vaccines, the mRNA vaccines, which are already excellent. I'm not sure how we're going to do better than those. Maybe there is some new technology coming that we haven't heard about yet, top secret, which will come out and it will be even better, and maybe longer lasting and broader protection, and that would be fantastic. So in the short term, I think the vaccines we have are already pretty good. What was the second part of your question?
Just what could we expect from them?
Yeah, so that we don't know right now what we can look forward to. Actually, one thing I am aware of is some people have been thinking they may wait until other vaccines are available, but there's certainly no indication that I'm aware of that there's going to be anything better in the coming 12 months than what we already have.
It's incredible the rates of efficacy that we have from the Pfizer and from the Moderna vaccine. So if you're already an A+ student getting 95% grades and now you're getting to 91%, you're still pretty happy, right? And that's what you're getting as your efficacy rates against something like the South African variant. Whereas the reports for like the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is like a 70% effective vaccine, is now dropping to like only 10%. And so for some of these vaccine platforms, it is going to really matter as to how they recognise the viral variants. And I think that in Hong Kong, having the luxury of choice of such a highly effective vaccine that is able to recognise these variants, that we're really quite lucky here that you have really the best vaccines available. But I think that all of these vaccines have an advantage currently already. Like if we have no immunity, this is a really nasty virus, and it's really important to actually get vaccinated, because having a vaccine response for anything is going to protect you to some extent. And so for people that have been vaccinated, there's been huge reductions in death. Even if you could still potentially be infected, you're not dying. And that's really quite critical in a pandemic and reducing the stress on the healthcare system. So all the vaccines that are available have passed the WHO minimum threshold of 50% efficacy, and it's just that we have some superstar A+ students in the class as well. Like you guys.
Okay, so thank you very much for those very concise answers to our questions. The last part of this broadcast will be the audience's questions asked by Anastasia and Marie. The first question will be asked by Anastasia.
Yes, good evening. So the first question from the public is, do you think COVID will become like a permanent pandemic and stay with us, for example, like a common flu?
I think it will turn into a milder infection in people in the coming years. I don't think it will disappear from the world. So in previous years, we've had common cold infections from a lot of different viruses, including some coronaviruses. And I think the COVID virus will become one of those. But that will only happen once a population, maybe Hong Kong, maybe somewhere else, has a high vaccine coverage so that there's no more serious disease. Or maybe some other place like in India maybe, where there's a lot of infections, and so there won't be any future serious epidemic waves, because the second or third time that people get infected, it will be much milder.
So the SARS-CoV-2 virus is part of the coronavirus family, and there's already 4 viruses that cause the common cold. We've also had, within the last 20 years, 2 outbreaks of coronaviruses, so SARS in 2003 and then MERS from, I guess, 2013.
Yep.
And because they were more effectively controlled through public health measures, because they don't have this asymptomatic period, because they cause more overt symptoms when they are contagious, they were able to be contained. So SARS-CoV-2 is behaving much more like these common cold viruses, in that you have an asymptomatic period, you're spreading through a population, but it does cause a more serious illness, but not to the extent like SARS and MERS, which were more lethal when they had infection.
Okay, thank you very much. The second question from our public is, what is the minimum proportion of vaccinated population to reach in order to achieve herd immunity?
Yeah. Herd immunity is a concept where a sufficiently high proportion of the population are immune even to being infected, so that the virus just can't spread except in small pockets. If there's a small pocket of people that are still susceptible, then you could have an outbreak there. But in the whole population, if there's a high enough level of immunity, then there won't be the possibility to have a large epidemic anymore. We're not totally sure whether that level is 50, 60, 70, 80% immunity in the population, but we can use some algorithms to estimate approximately where it should be, probably around 70% for a place like Hong Kong. And to get 70% of the population to be immune in a place like Hong Kong, we'll need to vaccinate more than 70%, because the vaccines are not 100%. If we use a lot of vaccines that are highly effective, then we can get to that level with a little bit more, maybe 75%. But if we use a mix of vaccines, some are more effective and some are less effective, it's actually quite tough to get to that high level of population immunity. And what may happen actually, and I think what may happen in some other parts of the world, is not exactly herd immunity from vaccines, but at least if the most vulnerable people can be vaccinated so that they won't be too sick if they still get infected, maybe they'll still spread infection. If at least the most vulnerable can be vaccinated, then COVID won't pose so much of a threat anymore. And so if there is an epidemic, it won't be so serious. It will still have an impact, but it won't be as bad as it would have been. And that may be the objective in some parts of the world that maybe have less effective vaccines. So they'll just aim to vaccinate the most vulnerable. They won't aim for herd immunity. In Hong Kong, that's an option, but I hope that we'll go for herd immunity.
Okay, thank you very much.
For the following two questions, we know you can't give us an exact answer. We will only like to hear about your opinion. So first of all, when do you see the world coming out of the pandemic and resuming normal life?
Israel, I think, already has, and it's probably the first place in the world to do so. They've achieved that through a high vaccine coverage with the BioNTech vaccine, which is a highly effective vaccine. They have about 60% of their population vaccinated with the first dose, and I think it's 55% with 2 doses. So it's not quite at the level of population immunity that I just mentioned for Hong Kong, but I think maybe Israel, the virus wouldn't spread quite as fast as it does in Hong Kong. But around that level, it does make sense that about 60% coverage is going to get you close to herd immunity. And of course, in Israel, they've had a lot of infections. I think the next to go back to normal will be some parts of Europe, maybe the United Kingdom by the summer, and also the United States. Some parts of the United States have already kind of gone back to normal, although it's a bit early, a bit premature. For Asia, I think it's going to take longer because we're a little bit behind in vaccinating, and we don't have a lot of natural immunity as well. So in a place like United Kingdom, they have a lot of natural immunity, and now they use a lot of vaccine as well, so they can get up to that herd immunity threshold where COVID is no longer a threat. For Hong Kong, we so far have 12% maybe with the first dose, and so we're a long way behind. I don't think we'll be able to go back to normal this year, and I think something may have to change in terms of the policies for vaccination if we are to get back to normal in the coming year or two. I hope that will be the case.
Okay, thank you. The second question is about herd immunity. Should we be waiting for herd immunity in order to open the borders between countries?
For Hong Kong, we actually do face a choice. So the first choice I think we could make is to just keep the status quo. I hope that's not the choice, but that is a choice. So what I mean is, in Hong Kong, never mind about vaccination, maybe we just stay as we are with the quarantines, with a lot of testing, and if there's a surge in cases, then do the social distancing, to close the schools, work at home, and carry on like that, not only for the coming months, but for the coming years. That is an option. I don't think it's a good option, but it is an option. Another possibility is that we aim for high vaccine coverage with highly effective vaccines to get to that level 70% immunity in the population. We're a long way from that right now. We have 10% of people with their first dose, and so the immunity level in the population is below 10%. It's a long way to go to get up to 70%, and there's a lot of people in Hong Kong that are not enthusiastic about the idea of getting vaccinated. So then the third choice, maybe the last choice, is to say, if we can at least vaccinate the most vulnerable people, maybe the older adults, the middle-aged adults, maybe also the younger adults, because they can be vulnerable to severe COVID. If we can at least vaccinate them, then we can go back to normal, understanding that COVID may still spread, may still cause severe illnesses, may even still cause some deaths, but we'll just tolerate it because we so much want to get back to normal. I think the second choice is the best, to go for herd immunity, because that would be the choice where there's the least impact of any subsequent epidemics of COVID. But so far, we're not on that track.
And this is where we have the resources, the actual vaccines available here. So to hear in the community that people are delaying or postponing or even maybe potentially not wanting vaccination, I actually ask them, why aren't you getting vaccinated? If you're not pro-vaccination, then for me that means you're pro-virus, because you are still completely susceptible to this infection. We can only do this on a community level where you can start to stop that train of transmission if enough people get vaccinated. So to actually have to wait for herd immunity. I think that the rate that we have here in Hong Kong isn't quick enough, in that the vaccine responses don't last forever. So we may need to get re-vaccinated again as well within the next coming year or 2 years, and the virus can circulate during that time. So I think that time is of the essence. We need everyone in the community to actually get vaccinated, and to see that if they don't, they're actually just postponing almost the inevitable of becoming infected. And it is a really nasty virus with some bad side effects and long-term effects. So I think it's important to try and reach herd immunity as soon as possible, so that we don't have the selection of these variants that can have more severe disease.
Okay, thank you. So, Dr. Valkenburg, you've just touched on that, but someone in the public is right now asking, so once you have been vaccinated, can you still get and transmit the virus?
So, to some extent, yes. So it's significantly reduced, substantially reduced. But even during the AstraZeneca trial, they did swab people every few weeks and tried to actually track for infections. And that's for one of the vaccine studies, because they did it so well and were really quite thorough in their study. They could identify that some vaccinated people did have some virus detection. Those people weren't having very much symptomatic disease, and they were shedding a lower amount of virus. So technically, yes, but if you have vaccination in the community, there's going to be, sustained transmission is completely dropping. So I think that on a technicality, there is some potential for it, but this is in really rare cases, and that these vaccines are preventing severe disease. They're also reducing infection, and they're reducing the viral load within people if they were infected at a very rare rate.
Okay, talking about the vaccines, why are they only available for those 16 and above?
When vaccines are first developed and then tested, we'll test them first in adults, because it would be a disaster if we test it in children and there's something nasty happens as a consequence. So it's adults first as the general principle, and that's what's happened with the COVID vaccines. But actually trials have been completed for children 12 to 16 years of age. With the BioNTech vaccine, it's fine, works very well. So I think within the next few months, we will see children aged 12 to 16 being able to get the BioNTech vaccine. And I know that some vaccines are already being tested in younger children as well. It goes step by step. Make sure it works in adults and it's safe in adults. If that's the case, then go to older children, and then finally go to younger children. So maybe by the end of this year, we'll even see vaccines being used in younger children, so that eventually everybody could get vaccinated.
Okay, when you're talking about adults, are you also including elderly people?
Often when vaccines are developed and tested, vaccine companies will choose to test them in younger adults, because younger adults tend to respond better to vaccines and also don't have underlying medical conditions like heart disease, which could be exacerbated by vaccination. So when you get a vaccination, sometimes you get an inflammation, a fever, and some other symptoms. And if your body already has some other condition, there's a risk it can make it worse. So for some vaccines, the testing is mostly done on healthy younger adults, and then some vaccines maybe are more ambitious, expanding the age range, expanding the conditions. So right now in Hong Kong, we have the two vaccines, the BioNTech and the Sinovac. And the BioNTech was actually tested in people of all types, adults of all types, including elderly. The Sinovac trials were limited, though, to people 18 to 60 years of age. They didn't really test older people for whatever reason. And so we would imagine that the Sinovac vaccine works very well, very safe in older people as well, elderly as well. But there's not so much data from the clinical trials so far.
Thank you. So now we have another question from the public. So is HKU Pasteur involved in a COVID-19 vaccine development?
I don't think there is one vaccine being developed in Hong Kong U, but not in the Pasteur Centre. But it's something that could happen in the future. Sophie might do that.
Yeah, I'd really like to. I think that so the vaccines, really, it was important to sort of be at the start of the race, at the start of last year, to basically already have these plug-and-play platforms. And we were really interested in the response to infection, to try and gauge what was happening in some of these patients. And so that's where our research has been focused. We are, currently thinking about those next generation vaccines and how we can address the variants of concern. And we do have some vaccine platforms. Our director does have a grant that's just been approved, and we'll be investigating some novel vaccine platforms that are really different to what's available. And I'm not sure how much I can really talk specifically about it.
Yeah, so in the future, maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe.
But I think that this is something within the next year you'll start to see results coming up from the Pasteur about the vaccine platforms. And I think that it was really important to have those early vaccines, and now that there's been some more data about what the patients that have done better, what type of immune correlates they have actually had that we need in these next generation vaccines too.
Okay, thank you.
This next question is again asking for your opinion. Do you have any idea when Hong Kong or even any other country will allow quarantine-free travel for fully vaccinated people?
So I think South Korea is the first country that's announced that they will do that. They just announced it yesterday or 2 days ago, that for fully vaccinated travellers into South Korea, they don't need to do the quarantine. I think it's something we could do in Hong Kong, but there is a risk associated with it. So the advantage is that fully vaccinated people pose a much lower risk of bringing in infection, but it's not a zero risk. So if people are really, really risk averse, then maybe they'll imagine that Hong Kong should be as isolated as possible from the rest of the world, so that there's a minimum, almost zero risk of the virus coming into Hong Kong. If it did come in, we know what will happen, that we'll have to do the social distancing again, close the schools again, close the workplaces again. But my view is that we can't ever achieve a zero risk. At the same time, it's important to acknowledge the advantage of being vaccinated, and having quarantine-free travel into Hong Kong would be a very good incentive. I think a very important incentive to encourage people to choose to get vaccinated. Because if the vaccine rate stays very low and we do decide we'd like to go back to normal, then we have to think of some way to persuade people to get vaccinated, either with incentives or with penalties. And I prefer the way of incentives.
You sort of think that there's only for so long that you can be this sealed island as such an international community, that we don't have a lot of the resources to produce things in Hong Kong. Like, we're needing this importing, exporting. Like, Hong Kong's a dynamic city. And so to basically seal yourself against a virus that isn't going anywhere, it's here with us to stay. And I think that we need to think of the long-term solutions to reopening up. And that there should be maybe testing if you are having quarantine-free travel. There could be testing a few days later, but I think that it's unsustainable to have quarantine long-term, and I hope we see the end of that. I guess a lot of us here are international people. We really want to see our family in these other countries. We really want to be able to actually connect with other scientists that we're communicating with all the time otherwise. But I hope quarantine-free travel comes really soon, and I can't wait for it soon enough. I'm vaccinated and ready to go.
Okay, thank you. Well, a question related to quarantine. So we've seen around the world quarantine lasting for 10 days up to 3 weeks. So what do you think is the ideal quarantine period for non-vaccinated people?
When someone's infected, most likely, if they're going to develop symptoms, if they're going to start to shed the virus and become contagious, it will happen within a few days. About half the people that are infected, that will happen within 5 or 6 days. And for some people it's longer, 6, 7 days, even up to 10 days, even 14 days. And we've heard of some cases which are even longer than that. So the threshold of 14 days has been quite a common choice, because it captures probably 98 or 99% of infections within that window. But then there's still that 1% at the end. So then in Hong Kong there's a decision to go to 21 days, because that's probably 99.9%. So then there's only 1 in 1,000 that goes beyond that. And I think I heard of one place that was thinking of 28 days, maybe Macau, 28 days. So that may be 99.999%. And then it's only 1 in 10,000 or 100,000 that could to come out the end and then start shedding virus. So there's a trade-off. I mean, keeping people for longer in quarantine is, for most people, a waste of their time and a waste of money. But at the same time, if your aim is to have almost zero risk, then the longer the better. So I actually thought that 14 days was long enough, and 14 days has been long enough in Taiwan, in Australia, in New Zealand and Singapore. They haven't had problems with people coming out of quarantine and then spreading infection. But in Hong Kong, the decision is made to go to 21 days for now, to be even more safe.
And this is where apparently there's only been really like 2 introductions into Hong Kong can count for like 95% of cases. So it can spread so quickly, and just even having that one case after the 21-day period, because it can spread so rapidly. So it just depends on the risk adverse or the threshold for tolerance of having cases in the community and how quickly you can pick them up before they can spread further. And I think that now there's a lot of surveillance of the water in Hong Kong to actually try and find if there's community spread before there's identification of cases. So people are trying to look for these cases ahead of time, and if there is introduction, to have really quick and effective measures so there isn't wider spread.
Thank you.
We already talked about herd immunity, and you mentioned that the UK and the US might achieve it in the near future. But when do you think France will be able to achieve herd immunity?
France may take a little bit longer actually, because the uptake of vaccine hasn't been so high so far. And so what we understand, there's 2 ways to get to herd immunity. Either you have a lot of infections or you have a lot of vaccinations. In France, there have been some infections, but not nearly enough to lead to herd immunity. So they're going to have to get to a high vaccine coverage. I hope the situation will change. I know there's been a lot of sick people in France in the past year, a lot of mortality from COVID-19, but for whatever reason, people are not so enthusiastic about the vaccine. And it's not only in France, in Hong Kong it's even worse actually in terms of the hesitancy. But it's something that will have to be resolved for France to be secure in opening back up and going back to normal. Maybe when they see other countries achieving that, like the UK, like Israel, like the US, then maybe there'll be a more enthusiasm to get vaccinated. We'll see.
I was playing with this little platform on a news website the other day, and it was really interesting talking about the vaccination rates in different countries and the time frame of when they'll actually reach a herd immunity threshold. And so for like the US, UK, it's really just in the next few months, whereas for somewhere like the Philippines, it was 2036.
Based on vaccination?
Yeah, the vaccination rate, like they had a handful of vaccinations per 100,000 people.
But they have a supply shortage.
Yeah.
And then somewhere like France, I don't think there's so much of a supply shortage.
So it's a luxury of choice, and to be really refusing a vaccine that's available when you would actually be infected otherwise. It seems like we need a lot more positive PR on the vaccine front and communication about the extremely rare events that are dissuading some of these people from being vaccinated are incredibly rare compared to what would happen if you're infected. And I think that in France that's what's maybe the news headlines are imbalanced about the benefits of vaccination compared to these incredibly rare events. We were talking about the rates, and I think that it's still only really being studied and determined as to if they are directly linked and what that rate would actually be. But the risk of other activities like taking the pill, catching a plane, and people that are smoking is incredibly high. And these are all things that people are normally doing in France. I think there's a much higher rate of smoking and blood clots than there would be for vaccination.
Thank you. So someone in the public is asking, how come the vaccine may give you symptoms?
It's actually a good thing if you get some symptoms after vaccination, because it means your body's identified the invader, the stuff in the vaccine, and is responding to it in the way that it should be. So it's picked up that there's something that shouldn't be there, and it's checking out what it is, learning about it, and then creating some new components in your immune system which could fight it off if it came back again. And so actually when I hear about my colleagues or friends that had a fever after vaccination, I said that's actually a good sign, because it means your body reacted very well to the vaccine. Of course, we want to be cautious, because if the symptoms are too strong, then it's really uncomfortable and there can be some other consequence. But something like a fever and fatigue and pain in the arm is actually very, very normal.
You're really giving your immune system an education of how to fight the virus when you are infected. So your immune system starts to see it as a threat. You start to have that local inflammation, you have cell recruitment, you start to amplify the army of cells that can kill the virus if you are infected. but you're getting that benefit from vaccination and not from infection. So I think that you have to have a trade-off. You can't have something for free in expecting that you can be infected with a highly lethal virus but not actually have anything happen to you beforehand when you're trying to train your immune system. So by building that army of cells, by making these antibodies, you need to have inflammation to drive those cells to make more copies of themselves, because otherwise your body, you know, in a steady state is in a state of like tolerance. You're basically just not seeing a threat, you're not having that inflammation. And if you're thinking you can get that army of cells to target the virus in that tolerance type state, then you're not going to be so well trained to fight the actual threat of the virus.
Okay, another question from the public is, what vaccine would you consider most effective against the virus?
There's two vaccines which are highly effective: the BioNTech vaccine, which we have in Hong Kong, and the Moderna vaccine, which we don't have in Hong Kong. So those are the two best choices around the world, and it's really good for us in Hong Kong that we have the BioNTech vaccine available. So I've been encouraging all my friends and colleagues to go for the BioNTech vaccine, and I think if a lot of people in Hong Kong choose that, if we can use up all the doses which we've ordered, 7.5 million doses, it's really great for Hong Kong to get up to a higher level of population immunity going towards herd immunity.
And I think that you think of maybe what's available in France, there's other vaccine platforms as well, and some vaccines have advantages in different settings as well. So we've talked about the thermostability, so how fragile the RNA vaccines are. But if you start to actually have wider community vaccination programs, somewhere like Australia where you're geographically spread out, they're using the AstraZeneca vaccine. In Cambodia, they're using the AstraZeneca vaccine. The Johnson & Johnson also uses a viral vector. And because these are a little bit more thermostable, so you can keep them in a regular fridge, you can reach a wider area of people without them needing to come to these special vaccine centres like we have in Hong Kong. And I think in France, they're also using that viral vector AstraZeneca vaccine in the wider population centre as well. So although you might have different rates of efficacy, they're all reducing death from these from the virus as well. So they have advantages in different settings, in different conditions of storage, and so that can actually determine how far and wide you can take them out to the population.
Thank you. So next question from our public is, so someone heard about universal vaccine. So they'd like to know what's the difference with the vaccine we're having now and how does it work?
The idea of a universal vaccine is probably a vaccine that doesn't need to be boosted again for many, many years and provides cross-protection against whatever kind of changes the virus will come up with, so the variants in the future as well. Right now, we're not sure the extent to which maybe the BioNTech vaccine, how long it will last, what protection it will give you against future variants, but my guess is it will be pretty good still for a few years. So that may already be a type of universal vaccine, but of course there may be some new technology in the future which is even better, and it might be the kind of vaccine which you only ever need once in your life, and then you're protected forever. That would be ideal, but that's like a dream. So people talk about the dream, and that would be the dream.
There's a vaccine call from an organisation called CEPI, and they're wanting like a pan-coronavirus vaccine, so to actually even protect against future pandemic viruses that could come from coronaviruses.
Like SARS or MERS or whatever comes out in the future.
Yeah, and I think it is such a dream because it's such a difficult target to find a common section of this virus between all these different diverse virus families. So I think that if you think of the rate of evolution of viruses is hundreds of millions of copies within a few days, the difference between these viruses families can be quite large. So to have a pan-coronavirus vaccine is being proposed, and I think achieving that is going to be really quite difficult. Maybe you'll find some common subfamilies, so beta coronaviruses like SARS and MERS will be covered in these type of vaccines, hopefully in the future. But to find the common theme is really going to be a special design.
Thank you.
We have a lot of sanitary precautions against COVID-19. Which one of them is the most effective against this pandemic?
The most effective of all is going to be social distancing. So the person who wants to reduce their risk of infection to zero is the person who will find their own flat and stay in it by themselves for months or for years. Because if you don't have contact with other people, your risk of infection is really minimal. Having said that, in Hong Kong, there have been a number of incidents of transmission through either through the vents in the flats or from one flat to another. So I guess the kind of person would have to be someone who lives by themselves in the forest in a house and doesn't meet anybody else. Maybe they order their online shopping and online supermarket and never meet the person who comes. But in reality, that's really, really difficult. And for society, it's not good to have social distancing measures in place for too long. So for now in Hong Kong, because we don't have a lot of cases in the community, I think it's a good idea to relax the social distancing measures, allow people to meet up again, go to beaches that Sophie's very happy about, and bars are open again. But it's still important to keep some level, so the face masks are important, hand washing is important, because we don't want the opportunity for the virus to spread too soon, because then we'll need those measures back again.
We sort of think of transmission like the settings of where it occurs. I know that Ben studied a lot about the different interactions that have higher risk of transmission, and I think that inside with masks off, you've talked a lot about how dining, spending hours over a table with someone with your mask off in low air exchange settings is the riskiest place to actually become infected. And I think that's where in Hong Kong having distancing between some of the restaurants, having the increased rates of airflow is really important. And I was really sad that restaurants were open up at such a greater rate and beaches were closed for so long, because I think being outside in the beach with the UV that kills the virus, being distanced from everyone, and it's good for our mental health to go to the beach. Whereas these restaurants where you can actually have a lot of people coming together from lots of different settings, sitting together for hours, slurping some hot noodles, I think that's a setting for transmission. So I think that it's important for the hygiene measures to have distancing between some of the tables, so that you sort of stay in your pod of friends that you maybe know their interactions, or you're meeting them each day for lunch. So for the time being, I think it's important to have airflow in these restaurants and to have increased distancing between them.
Maybe I can supplement one final comment. In terms of the measures which have been used in Hong Kong in the past year to control COVID, in the social distancing measures, we have people working at home, we have restaurant spacing and ventilation, we have schools closed, we have limits on numbers of people that can gather together. I think it's the last one, limiting the large groups of people gathering together, that's maybe been one of the most important measures. So not allowing larger venues to have lots of people in them at the same time, because we know one of the things that COVID does very well is spread very rapidly in enclosed spaces when there's a lot of people around, with super spreading events. And so if we can limit the chance for super spreading events to occur, then that can do a lot of good. So limiting the larger groups, I think, has been a particularly important component of our preventive measures.
Okay, so thank you very much. We're coming to the end of this show. Thank you very much for agreeing to come to this set with us, so Professor Ben Cowley and Dr. Sophie Valkenburg, and for providing such insightful answers to the question we have been asking ourselves about COVID-19 and the ways of preventing it. It was truly a delight to have you here today. Thank you. We would also like to thank the classes of Second, Madame Viguier and Monsieur Jom's classes, as well as Madame Guillard's Première Space VT class. Thank you to Mr. Charbonneau for making this live broadcast possible, first at the FIS. Thank you to the IT department and the managing department, managing department, for making this live broadcast experience a first student-led experience. We hope to have answered all of the questions you have been asking yourself about COVID and the ways of prevention. Have a very good evening, goodbye, and see you next time.